There is a plant growing in Amish backyards right now that can fuel a diesel engine, heat a home, run a generator, and power farm equipment. And it costs nothing to grow, nothing to harvest, and nothing to process beyond equipment that most people already own. The Amish have been using this plant as a fuel source since 1887, not as a backup, not as an experiment, as a primary, dependable, generational fuel system that has kept their machinery running and their farms operating through every oil crisis, every fuel price spike, and every supply chain disruption of the last 137 years. While the rest of the world was getting hooked on fossil fuels, the Amish were growing their own, and the plant at the center of all of it is one you have almost certainly walked past without a second thought. The plant is called Camelina sativa. And before you switch off because that sounds too scientific or too obscure, stay with me, because the story of this plant, why the Amish adopted it, how they process it, and why it nearly disappeared from American agriculture entirely, is one of the most fascinating and deliberately buried stories in the history of energy. This is not a fringe theory. This is not alternative medicine or pseudoscience. Camelina was used as a lamp oil and machine lubricant across Europe for over 1,000 years before petroleum came along and made it economically inconvenient for the people selling petroleum. The Amish never made the switch, and today, as fuel prices climb and energy independence becomes something people are suddenly taking seriously, Camelina is being rediscovered in ways that would seem extraordinary if the plant's track record were not already so thoroughly established. The United States Navy tested Camelina-based biofuel blends in its jet aircraft and surface ships as part of its Great Green Fleet initiative. United Airlines conducted commercial flight tests using Camelina-derived jet fuel. The United States Air Force flew an A-10 Thunderbolt on a 50-50 blend of Camelina jet fuel and conventional jet fuel at full combat power. Agricultural universities across the northern United States and Canada have published extensive research confirming Camelina's yield potential, its compatibility with existing farm equipment, and its oil quality for both food and fuel applications. The plant the Amish never stopped growing is now being studied by the Pentagon and flown in military aircraft. The Amish, characteristically, have not commented on any of this. They were already right, and have been for 130 years. Let us start with what Camelina actually is, because understanding the plant is the foundation of understanding why it works so well as a fuel. Camelina sativa is a flowering plant in the mustard family, related to canola, but hardier, more drought-tolerant, more cold-tolerant, and significantly less demanding in terms of soil quality and inputs. It grows to about 3 feet tall, produces small yellow flowers, and develops dense clusters of small seed pods, each packed with tiny seeds that contain between 38 and 42% oil by weight. That oil content is the critical number. For comparison, soybeans, the dominant biofuel crop in the United States today, contain between 18 and 20% oil by weight. Camelina produces more than twice the oil yield per pound of seed. And unlike soybeans, which require rich, well-prepared soil, adequate rainfall, and often significant fertilizer inputs to perform, Camelina thrives on marginal land that most farmers would not bother planting anything else in. Poor soil, low rainfall, cold springs, late frosts. Camelina handles all of it with a resilience that most cultivated crops simply cannot match. The growth cycle is extraordinarily fast by agricultural standards. Camelina is planted in early spring, often directly into cold soil when other crops would fail to germinate, and it reaches full maturity and seed harvest readiness in 85 to 100 days. In most of the continental United States, that means you can get a full Camelina harvest and still have time to plant a second crop in the same growing season. Some Amish farmers in the northern states run 2 Camelina cycles per year, spring planting for a summer harvest, followed by a fast-maturing vegetable or grain crop before frost. The land never sits idle. The fuel production never stops. Here is the number that makes people stop and actually do the math. 1 acre of camelina, grown on average land with no irrigation and minimal inputs, produces between 60 and 100 gallons of oil per acre per season. On good land, with attentive management, that number climbs higher. The Amish, who have been selecting and saving their best seed stock for generations, consistently report yields at the upper end of that range. 100 gallons of oil per acre. An average American car travels roughly 30 miles per gallon of gasoline equivalent. 1 acre of camelina processed into biodiesel can power a vehicle for approximately 3,000 miles. Grow 5 acres, and you have covered 15,000 miles of driving. A full year of average American vehicle use from your own backyard, from a crop that costs almost nothing to grow because it needs almost no inputs, and its seed stock is saved and replanted year after year from the previous harvest. Now let us talk about how the oil actually gets from the seed to the engine, because this is where the Amish system gets genuinely ingenious. The first step is harvesting, which the Amish do in the same way their ancestors harvested grain, with a threshing process that separates the seeds from the dried plant material. Traditional Amish communities do this with hand tools or horse-drawn equipment. More progressive communities use small mechanical threshers. Either way, the equipment is simple, human scale, and entirely within the technical capability of anyone willing to learn the process. Once the seeds are harvested and dried, a critical step, because moisture in the seed reduces oil quality and promotes spoilage during storage, they go through a cold press oil expeller. This is the piece of equipment that most people have never heard of, and that changes everything about the economics of this system. A cold press oil expeller is a mechanical device that works by pressing seeds under high mechanical pressure through a narrow die, forcing the oil out of the seed material through the friction and compression of the screw press mechanism. No heat beyond what is naturally generated by the mechanical friction. No chemical solvents. No industrial processing. No specialized knowledge beyond what can be learned in an afternoon. The oil flows out one end in a steady, clear stream, and the remaining seed cake, which still contains significant protein and fiber, compacts out the other end as a solid cylinder that breaks apart into meal. The Amish have been using versions of this technology since the late 19th century. Early hand-cranked screw presses were used across rural Europe and America for olive oil, linseed oil, and lamp oil production long before electricity made mechanical presses commonplace. The Amish maintained the knowledge and the practice of seed pressing through the 20th century, while the broader agricultural world outsourced oil production to industrial processors and stopped thinking of oil as something a farm family could make themselves. Today, entry-level manual cold press expellers capable of processing camelina seed can be purchased for between $200 and $400. A good quality motorized mechanical expeller capable of processing meaningful quantities, enough to fuel a working farm, runs between $800 and $2,000. Either way, it is a one-time equipment purchase that then produces fuel indefinitely from seed stock that costs nothing beyond the labor of growing and harvesting it. The machine pays for itself, in most cases, within a single growing season. The oil that comes out of the expeller at this stage is called straight vegetable oil, or SVO. And here is something that most people do not know, but that is absolutely central to understanding why the Amish have been using this fuel since 1887. Rudolf Diesel, the German engineer who invented the diesel engine, designed his engine specifically to run on vegetable oil, not petroleum diesel. Vegetable oil. In 1900, at the World Exhibition in Paris, Diesel demonstrated his engine running on pure peanut oil to an audience of engineers and industrialists. He publicly stated that vegetable oil could be as important as petroleum for the future of the diesel engine, and that it would allow farmers and nations to be energy self-sufficient. He wrote in his own published papers that the use of plant oils as engine fuel may seem insignificant today, but that such products may in time become as important as petroleum and coal tar products. He was not a visionary speculating about the distant future. He was describing what his own engine was already doing in controlled demonstrations in 1900. The petroleum industry, which was growing with extraordinary speed and financial ambition at exactly that moment in history, had a very strong commercial interest in ensuring that diesel engines became permanently dependent on petroleum diesel rather than on vegetable oils that any farmer could grow and process independently on their own land. If every farm could produce its own fuel, there was no market for petroleum diesel. The entire economic model of the emerging oil industry depended on creating and maintaining fuel dependency, on ensuring that the energy source and the consumer were separated by as many commercial layers as possible. The rest of that story is, in many ways, the defining story of the 20th century's global economy. Rudolf Diesel himself died under circumstances that have never been fully explained in 1913, falling from a ship into the English Channel on a night crossing, just as the push to standardize petroleum diesel as the universal fuel for his engine was reaching its critical and irreversible moment. Whether that death was accident, suicide, or something else has never been established. What is established is that within a few years of his death, the narrative around his engine had been completely rewritten, and the vegetable oil origins of the technology had been buried so thoroughly that most people today have no idea that diesel engines were not designed to run on fossil fuel at all. The Amish, characteristically, ignored the entire transition and kept doing what worked. Straight vegetable oil from camelina can be run directly in older, unmodified diesel engines, particularly the indirect injection diesel engines built before the mid-1990s, which are the engines most commonly used in older Amish farm equipment. For direct injection engines and modern diesel vehicles, the oil needs either to be blended with petroleum diesel in ratios up to about 20% or processed one step further into what is called biodiesel, through a chemical process called trans-esterification. The trans-esterification process sounds intimidating, but is actually remarkably simple in practice and has been performed at a small farm scale for well over a century. You combine the camelina oil with methanol, which can itself be produced from fermented plant material, though most small-scale processors source it from agricultural suppliers at low cost, and a small amount of lye or potassium hydroxide as a chemical catalyst. The mixture is heated gently to around 130 degrees Fahrenheit and agitated steadily. The chemical reaction proceeds over the course of 1 to 2 hours, breaking the triglyceride molecules of the vegetable oil apart and replacing the glycerin backbone with methanol molecules, producing the long-chain fatty acid methyl esters that are the chemical definition of biodiesel. Once the reaction is complete, the mixture is allowed to settle. The result is 2 cleanly separated layers, biodiesel floating on top and glycerin settling to the bottom as a dense, dark liquid. The biodiesel is then washed with water to remove any residual methanol or catalyst, dried, and it is ready for the fuel tank. The entire process, from oil to finished biodiesel, takes several hours of attended time and produces fuel that is chemically standardized and engine-ready. The glycerin separated out during the process is itself a commercially valuable byproduct. The Amish use it in soap making. Glycerin is a primary ingredient in quality handmade soap, in skincare preparations, and as a livestock feed energy supplement. Several Amish communities generate meaningful additional income from selling their glycerin byproduct to soap makers and cosmetics producers in nearby towns. The fuel production process, in other words, also produces a saleable product. Nothing is wasted, and nothing that comes out of the process lacks a clear and immediate use. The biodiesel that results from this process meets or exceeds the energy content of petroleum diesel and can be run in any diesel engine at any blend ratio, including 100% pure biodiesel with no engine modification required. It burns cleaner than petroleum diesel, lower particulate emissions, lower carbon monoxide, lower unburned hydrocarbons, The only significant variable is cold weather performance, as biodiesel can gel at lower temperatures than petroleum diesel. The Amish solution to this, characteristically, is practical and costs nothing. They store biodiesel in insulated tanks near the barn or in cellars where temperature is stable, and they blend with a small percentage of petroleum diesel during the coldest winter months when temperatures drop below freezing consistently. The seed cake left over after oil pressing is where the system reveals another layer of its elegance. Camelina seed cake contains approximately 38% protein by dry weight, making it one of the most protein-dense animal feed byproducts in agriculture. The Amish feed it to their chickens, their pigs, their cattle, and their draft horses. Studies conducted by agricultural universities, including North Dakota State University and the University of Idaho, have confirmed that camelina meal as a feed supplement supports healthy growth and production in poultry and livestock with no adverse effects. What this means in practical terms is that the fuel production process produces animal feed as a byproduct. You grow camelina, press the seeds, fuel your equipment with the oil, and feed the pressed cake to your animals. The same crop simultaneously addresses two of the most significant costs in small-scale farming: fuel and feed, from a single acre of marginal land. The straw and plant material remaining after the seeds are harvested has yet another use. Dried camelina straw is a reasonable quality animal bedding material comparable to wheat straw in absorbency and comfort. It composts readily, breaking down into organic matter that is returned to the field as natural fertilizer for the next camelina planting. The nutrient cycling is nearly closed. What comes out of the field goes back to the field, mediated by the animals in the composting process, keeping soil fertility stable over decades without purchased inputs. It is worth pausing here to understand just how comprehensively this one plant addresses the input costs that bankrupt small farms. Fuel is the single largest variable operating cost for most working farms. Feed is the second largest. Fertilizer is the third. Camelina deployed the way the Amish deploy it eliminates or dramatically reduces all three simultaneously. The fuel comes from the oil. The feed comes from the cake. The fertilizer comes from the composted straw and animal manure generated by the animals fed on the cake. The system is almost perfectly circular, which is exactly why it has sustained Amish farming operations for over a century, without requiring those farms to be financially integrated into the broader fossil fuel economy. The yield calculation becomes even more striking when you model it over a multi-year period with proper seed saving. In the first year, an Amish farmer purchases or trades for an initial quantity of camelina seed, perhaps enough to plant 1 acre. They harvest that acre, press a portion of the seed for oil, and save the remaining seed for the following year's planting. Because camelina produces such abundant seed relative to what is needed for replanting, after the first full harvest cycle, the farmer has enough seed to plant significantly more acreage the following year, without purchasing any additional inputs. Within 3 to 5 years, a family that started with 1 acre of camelina can be running multiple acres of fuel production, entirely from seed stock generated by the original planting. The per-gallon cost of fuel, once you account only for labor and amortize the cost of the expeller over its working life, drops to somewhere between 15 and 30 cents per gallon, not 15 to 30% less than the pump price. 15 to 30 cents per gallon for diesel fuel equivalent. The reason this plant nearly vanished from American agriculture has nothing to do with its performance and everything to do with economics of scale and the power of established industries. When petroleum diesel became cheap and universally available in the mid-20th century, the economic case for growing your own fuel collapsed for most farmers who were already integrated into the cash economy. Why spend the time growing and pressing camelina when diesel was 30 cents a gallon at the pump? The Amish, who were not economically integrated into that system in the same way, continued growing it anyway, not as an economic calculation, but as a principle. They did not want to be dependent on something they could not produce themselves. That principle looked eccentric for about 50 years. Then oil prices spiked in the 1970s, and it started looking prudent. Then they spiked again in the 2000s. Then supply chains collapsed in 2020, and fuel prices hit generational highs in 2022. And suddenly, the Amish, sitting on their camelina plots, pressing their oil expellers, filling their equipment tanks with fuel. They grew in their own fields, looked less like an anachronism, and more like the only people in the country who had been paying attention. Subscribe, because everything the Amish have quietly figured out about fuel, food, water, and energy is exactly what this channel is here to document. And we are just getting started.